Hello and welcome to this special. I've been looking forward to this conversation because ancient Indian history is really as vast as it is complex. And adding to the enigma of the history as such, even for a student of history in India, is the fact that there's such large gaps in our understanding of our ancient past. Add to this the overarching influence that our epics and our Puranas have on the way we look at our past. And it's a real mixture which has resulted in the creation of numerous stereotypes and, of course, myths of this great utopia that was ancient India. Today, we focus into various aspects of the history of the early period of India. We look there at the contradictions that exist in two ways. One, in our perception of our past, and the second, within history itself. To take us through this journey, we have renowned historian and author Dr. Upender Singh, who has done seminal work on ancient Indian history. The last couple of books of hers was on the idea of ancient India, the politics of power, and of course also the political violence that is intrinsic, which we don't really talk about. Her latest book is The Culture of Contradictions in Ancient India, and she joins us today. By the way, Dr. Singh was also my professor, so this is a especially important evening for me. And Dr. Singh, many thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Minnie. It's wonderful to be talking about my latest book with you and to be on Live History. I'm really happy to have this opportunity.
Fantastic. And it's been such a long since we met and spoke, and I'm so happy that this is allowing us to do that, because I've been, of course, a great fan of your work. Also, I must tell you, you instilled a lot of the love for ancient Indian history and history in general, as far as our students went. So it's really wonderful to have you here. My first question is that this is, I think, your 12th book, Dr. Singh, and this has really been a journey of sorts, Take us through what led you to talk about these large issues, and we will talk about each of these contradictions, as you put it. But what led you to this, and how did the last couple of books build up towards this?
Well, Minnie, I'm both a teacher and a researcher, and my teaching and research are very closely connected. This particular book is more connected with my teaching than any of my previous books. Mm-hmm. There you see the beautiful Apsara on the cover of the book. So, in Ashoka University, where I teach, we have foundation courses. And I was asked to teach a foundation course on Indian civilizations. I was very daunted at this prospect, because although I've been teaching forever. I've been teaching since 1981. I taught in St. Stephen's, where I taught you. And then I moved to the University of Delhi and then Ashoka University. And I've written a great deal, researched on various aspects of ancient India. But when I was faced with the prospect of telling students from different disciplinary backgrounds with different interests, when I was faced with the prospect of teaching them about Indian civilizations, it was a course, the title is in the plural, I was wondering how to go about it. And remember, this is a course that had to be taught within the span of 13 weeks. So not much time, a massive topic. What was I to do? So I started thinking about this issue, and I drew on my previous work. As you've mentioned, my book that came out before this was on political violence. So I had been thinking about violence and non-violence. Other issues that I touched on in this book are issues that have preoccupied my attentions. There's a great deal, for instance, that you find in this book, which has been touched on in my book on the history of ancient and early medieval India, which is a book for general readers, and it's also a book for students. And although it seems to be some kind of a textbook giving an overview, which it does, I have actually inserted many of the things that I care very deeply about regarding ancient India into the book. So this particular book, Minnie, emerged from a course that I taught, which I taught at Ashoka University. And I decided to organize my course thematically into the 5 themes that form the chapters of this book to a large extent. Of course, I did think beyond the course after I taught it. I did think more deeply. I did do some more reading, more research into some of the things, but I decided to organize the course and then the book around the themes of inequality and salvation, desire and detachment, goddesses and misogyny, violence and non-violence, debate and conflict. But I must tell you, I did not write this book only for students. I wrote it for general readers who are interested, and there's so much interest in ancient India out there. And I thought it is really important for historians to write for a wider audience. So the book is really something that lies at the intersection of my research, my teaching, and my desire to reach out to a larger audience.
I found it extremely timely, Dr. Singh, because, this kind of dips into a lot of facts that you have collated over a long period of time, archaeological excavations, reports, a lot of tangible facts. And what you have done is that you have actually looked at some very difficult areas in our own understanding of our history. And I go back to the gap between the perception of our past, especially lately, when there is a tendency to create this very romanticized, utopic, perception of our past and the reality. Why do you think that there is such a gap in this? Because one fact is, of course, there's so many gaps in our understanding of ancient Indian history. The second, I don't know, when I was reading your book, I realized that the overarching obsession with the epics, the Puranas as sources of history, has that in many ways created this sense, this perception of this utopia?
Well, one of the things that I say, I think in the conclusion of the book, is that the idea of ancient India as a utopia, where everything was wonderful, perfect, where there was social harmony and wonderful achievements in every sphere and nothing to complain about, that idea is misplaced. But so is the idea of a dystopia, which would tend to see ancient India as racked with inequality and oppression. And, very often the truth lies between extreme positions. But as a historian, it's not my job to judge. It's really to explain. And I think that the great amount of let's say, misperception that exists in the world at large, or at least within and among ordinary Indian readers, is because of the fact that historians have not succeeded in communicating to lay readers, people who have an interest in history but are not professional historians. I think we historians have also failed to a great extent in communicating, in explaining our discipline to ordinary people. And, history is not the same thing as opinion. The discipline of history is based on a very rigorous analysis of all kinds of primary sources. So whether it's texts or inscriptions, coins, archaeological data, so on and so forth. And the historian has to engage with the primary sources and come up with hypotheses that are logical, that are reasonable, that are convincing, using the evidence from the primary sources. And I think there's a lack of understanding of the sources of history and also of the historian's method. And these two things combined have led to all kinds of misperceptions about India's ancient past.
And that's at the heart of everything that we do at Live History India, Dr. Singh, even conversations like this, because I really believe that the good work being done on history, the fact that not all history is opinionated or rhetorical or prejudiced, has to be iterated, because there's such great work being done by scholars like you. I'm going to now delve into some of the chapters and some very interesting facets. I'm going to start with the issue of inequality and salvation, which is interesting because the general perception, and this comes back to your point that you have to look at ancient Indian history not in extremes, but somewhere in the middle. So even when it comes to inequality, you refer to the Rig Veda as having references to slavery, for instance, slaves, dasas, right? And yet you speak about Sangam literature where it is very ambiguous, the Varna and the Jati, that's very ambiguous. And I think you mentioned the Kakatiyas who were very proud to say that they were Shudras. So how do you explain this dichotomy? What was the general sense on inequality and social difference?
Well, Minnie, when we talk about ancient Indian society, we have to remember that we're talking about many societies.
Sure.
Just think of the subcontinent. Think about this vast geographical expanse that includes India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Sri Lanka. And you'll immediately realize that it's not one, but multiple societies and multiple cultures that we're looking at. And then when you try to trace the histories of these communities, these societies and cultures across the centuries, obviously there are going to be a lot of changes that take place in all respects. So I think it's important to try to first locate the institutional bases and the types of inequality in ancient Indian societies. And I've discussed slavery, Varna, caste, and in the book, I also go on to talk about gender inequality. So we need to understand the basic structures of inequality and then try to track them across the centuries and see how they changed and evolved. Mm-hmm. So caste is something that we can say becomes visible in our sources from about the 6th or 5th centuries BCE. But caste at that time, jati, let us use the word that occurs in the texts, is not the same as it is today. So the institution, all these institutions have histories, and the further back in time we go, the more difficult it becomes to reconstruct the details of these institutions. But certainly they are very important parts of the social history of ancient India. So there is plenty of inequality, there are social hierarchies, and then at the same time I've talked about how these hierarchies and inequalities were challenged, not through some kind of social revolution, but largely at the religious level.
Right. I have a question on that, but one other interesting thing that you point out is that most of what we know in the written form was written by the elites for the elites, in a sense. So a large part of our history remains unknown for the very reason that it's a very small sliver that we are looking at, right?
Absolutely. Most of our sources were written by elite men for elite men. So it becomes quite difficult, or let's say challenging, to try to uncover the histories of lower class, lower caste groups, women, because these are groups that did not have access to knowledge production. They remained outside the sphere of intellectual activity. So this is one of the big challenges in using textual sources to try to find the new histories of people who were on the margins or on the lower rungs of society.
I want to quote from your book. You said that the most influential questioning of inequality occurred in the religious front. It didn't take the clarion call of social equality, but was an assertion of the potential to attain spiritual salvation. And that's where your inequality and salvation chapter come. But it's very interesting because in Christianity, it was something that grew out of the lower quarters of the Roman Empire. The famous saying is that the meek will inherit the world. There was a question or an aspect of social justice to it, and so it was as social as it was religious. In India, all of the reformers, be it the Buddhist or Jain movements in the 5th, 6th century BCE, or the later Bhakti movement, was more in the spiritual realm. What is the evidence that shows that it did have an impact on society at all, or did the structure of society remain pretty much the same?
No, I think societies never remain the same. Change is part of history. And religion is an important part of history. So if I take the example of Buddhism, emerged in the 6th century BCE, the teachings of Jainism are actually older. And Jainism goes back to perhaps the 8th century BCE or so. So a lot of the time we focus on Buddhism, but Jainism is as, if not more interesting from the philosophical point of view, and also its ideas of nonviolence, but that's another story. But if you look at the Buddha's teaching, there is, of course, a philosophical, a doctrinal aspect to it. There is also an ethical code that is laid down, and that ethical code touches on social issues. Reading the early Buddhist texts gives you a sense of the social philosophy of Buddhism, and all religions, apart from their doctrines, do have their own take on society, on what constitutes the proper roles of people who live in society. The point to note is that sometimes we have very simplistic ideas about what the social philosophy of a particular religion might be. So for instance, in the case of Buddhism, there is an idea, largely because of the role that Buddhism played in modern India, the role of conversion to Buddhism by Ambedkar and other members of the scheduled caste. There is an idea about early Buddhism also that this was a religion that actually made a strong pitch for social equality. That's not exactly the way it was. The social philosophy of early Buddhism was certainly more what we would describe as progressive, more incorporative than the Brahminical tradition was. But there are various ways in which early Buddhism accepted the status quo, accepted the existence of inequality in the real world. So monks of all classes or varnas or jatis could join the Sangha. But it's a fact that is well known that the leadership within the Buddhist Sangha largely came from Brahmin monks, from upper class monks. So I think it's important to realize that the social history of these important religious movements is not as simple or straightforward as we might imagine. And of course, they did make an impact. I'm sure they did. And we can see the impact in, let's say, the kind of participation that is visible in donative inscriptions. If you look at Buddhist sites, if you look at sites like Sanchi, for instance, you see hundreds and hundreds of donations made by people from different walks of life who may, in a traditional Brahminical scheme of things, may not have been considered to be high class or upper class, but who found a way of expressing their religious piety and also to assert their social identity through making religious donations. So there are many different ways in which these religious traditions that questioned the prevailing hierarchies or raised important philosophical existential questions. There are different ways in which they did make an impact, but it's not as drastic or as sudden as might be imagined.
You make an interesting comparison. It's very important to look at history in the context of the world, because India and the subcontinent was not isolated. I mean, it was. So you speak about how caste is to the Indian subcontinent what race is to the West, right? I mean, there's an equal parallel. So it was a societal norm because it was all over the place. I mean, you had slavery in the Western world. You had a very stratified kind of society. So in a sense, was it the accepted norm? As a historian who's delved into different aspects, how do you reconcile the stratification of society?
Well, one of the problems is that when we look at unequal societies, we often don't realize that inequality was considered, as you said, the norm. It was taken for granted. Of course, there was also questioning of inequality. Slavery, for instance, is known in so many different parts of the ancient world. We actually have ideas about, how many free men to citizens to slaves existed in ancient Greece, and we know about its existence elsewhere as well. So institutions like slavery do exist across the world, and in fact have existed till very recent times. Okay, if you look at the abolition of slavery, it's one of the longest lived institutions of extreme social inequality and oppression that we know of. The point to note here is that inequality is not peculiar to India or to Indian history or to Indian society across the ages. It is a universal phenomenon. And some institutions like slavery are found across cultures. Some, such as caste, are peculiar to India. Gender inequality, which is another thing that I discuss, is found all over the world and continues to be found all over the world. So we need to identify what is universal, what is specific. And I think the comparative frame is really useful for us because we tend to be very myopic. We tend to be obsessed with ourselves, with India, with Indian history, but there's a huge world out there to explore where you can compare what was happening in India with other parts of the world. And I think that act of comparison is a very, very exciting way of deepening our understanding of Indian history.
Absolutely. One thing that is perhaps unique to India, at least I haven't seen it anywhere, is this dichotomy between desire and detachment. You talk about the exuberance of sexual visualization of sculptures in our temples and the very orthodox take on renunciation, on detachment in our scriptures, right? And this is true even in Buddhism and Jainism, because as we will talk later, the tantric influence comes in by the 10th, 11th century, and then it becomes again very visual. How do you reconcile this?
This is one of those major contradictions that we see in ancient Indian culture. And perhaps this is the time in which we can look at some of the images that are sprinkled throughout this book, because I think those images, along with the beautiful poetry that you will find excerpts of in translation in the book, they really express the theme of desire most eloquently. If you look at, for instance, this Mithuna couple, this is a terracotta found somewhere in Uttar Pradesh. These kinds of Mithuna couples, that's what art historians call them. Basically, they are couples who are, standing very close to each other affectionately, sometimes referred to as amorous couples. You find these couples very often in religious contexts, and clearly they were associated with auspiciousness, with fertility. It was considered a good thing to have these amorous couples in religious places. So, this is another respect in which our modern sensibilities don't match with what we see in ancient times. You referred to sensuous sculpture. There's so much sensuous sculpture, sensual sculpture, erotic, frankly, erotic sculpture. Of course, we know all about Khajuraho and the sexually explicit sculptures that are found there. But apart from that, there's a great deal of the sensuous and the sensual in Indian art. It's not only these Mithuna couples. If you look at the bodies of the Buddha, there is a sensuousness. Sensuous meaning something that appeals to the senses. That's not the same as sensual, which has to do with sexual desire, and it's not the same thing as erotic. So one needs to understand the differences between these terms. The bodies and the physique, the representation of the gods and goddesses in ancient India, again, extremely sensuous. So on the one hand, you have this very strong tradition which celebrates the body, which sees the body as something beautiful, as something which is beautiful even in a religious context. And on the other hand, you have the Jain monk. If we can see that image of this Jain monk walking along a riverbank. We don't know very much about this painting. It is a late painting. You would not describe this as a painting belonging to ancient India. It's 17th century. But in my book, apart from photographs of ancient sculpture. I have also included paintings from later times, from medieval times, and also modern and contemporary art, in order to show how certain themes and certain ideas from ancient India continue to inspire artists across the centuries. I think this is something that is very important to understand, and something I enjoyed exploring and displaying to my readers in this book. So just remember the Apsara, the celestial dancer, on the cover of the book, the front cover, and the back cover of the book has this Jain monk. And there you have it. That's the contradiction between, desire, the sensuous, the body, the celebration of the body on the one hand, which is a very strong element. It's there in not only in Indian art, it's there in Indian poetry, it's there in drama. There are beautiful love poems of the Sangam corpus. There are extremely exquisite love poems in the Prakrit language, in the Gatha Satasai. And then when you come to Sanskrit Kavya, it's love. Love is a theme that is celebrated across the centuries. And the love of man and woman is celebrated in so many different ways, in art, in poetry, in drama. So there is this very strong tradition. And then you have the Buddha, Mahavir, asceticism, giving everything up, just leaving your home and your worldly life behind. So it is one of several contradictions that existed and continue to exist in another form in our own time.
The good thing about this interview is I can get to ask you questions that I've always wanted to know about. So I'm going to ask you, this infusion of tantric element in not only Hinduism, but Buddhism and Jainism. We often, discuss in office how the Buddha would not recognize the Vajrayana Buddhism that is now so popular across Tibet and large tracts. How does this come in, and how do you see this spread through it? I mean, because then, we have the last image, for instance. It's a very tantric image, it's about the Shakti and the female and the male force reuniting, for example. This is very different from the Buddhism of the early period. How do you see this infusion coming?
Well, the history of Buddhism is a history of change. We are often sort of stuck in the early phase of Buddhism. And that is, frankly, the phase I find most attractive. I find the early Buddhism that is reflected in the Pali texts the most attractive, personally. But if you look at the history of Buddhism, there is then the emergence of new ideas and practices that are often referred to simplistically as Mahayana. And that happens at the turn of the millennium, early century CE. And then when we come to the 6th, 7th century onwards, then there's certainly a very powerful influence of Tantra. Many origins are often the most difficult things to explain, okay? Most difficult. But what we can see is that from the 5th, 6th century CE onwards, there are a set of ideas that we can describe as Tantra, making an impact not only in Buddhism and also Hinduism, but also, as you've mentioned, Jainism, less studied. Now, why and how this happened is another larger question, but certainly it did transform these religions in a major way. There's a lot of interesting writing on Tantra. Tantra is not easy to understand. Okay, it is very fascinating, but it is a very complex set of ideas, and it's not a religion. It is a set of ideas and practices that somehow made an impress across religions, across the board. So whether it is the importance of the feminine and masculine principle, I think there is a visual in the book from which actually brings that out. Kali and Bhairav in union. This is a watercolor from Nepal, and you find these kinds of images in tantric art, across the board. Now, what this also meant was the introduction of new kinds of rites and rituals, new texts. So the Buddhism of Tibet, of, the monasteries of Lahul and Spiti, where Buddhism is still going very strong, is extremely different, very, very different from early Buddhism. It's not all that easy to explain, but apart from the actual number of tantric practitioners, okay, those numbers may have been few, but they seem to have been rather influential in royal courts. And I think particularly tantric rituals were things that appealed to kings who might have wanted victories, wanted to acquire riches, or might have fed into the anxieties that royalty had. But they also did have an influence. The tantric groups did have an influence outside royal circles as well. So, and there's much about Tantra that is not very well understood. And as the experts in the field have pointed out, Tantra made an impact across the religious spectrum in ways that were not even especially regarded as being tantric. So it's a very slow, insidious kind of spread of a variety of ideas and beliefs represented in that one image.
Right. I'm going to skip a chapter and come back to the violence and non-violence. But, and I'm going to ask 2-3 questions before I ask the audience questions, because we've got a couple of questions coming in. But, when we look at our past, especially today, because there's so much of rhetoric around, especially the ancient past, there is a sense of it all being monolithic. There is this one dominant Puranic, Brahmanical Hinduism. But that's not true, because in the chapter on debate and conflict and discussions, you've spoken about how there were many, many ideas. There were many, many movements. Tantra was only one of the many movements. And very interestingly, which I didn't realize, you speak about Shankaracharya and the way he was seen even by the Dvaita Vedanta followers, because he was Advaita. And the fact that there was so much of criticism, there was so much of conflict, there was so many of these faiths vying with each other for popular support, for dominance, that it was really not as sanguine as we think it was in the religious space. Do explain that.
So there is a chapter, I think that's the chapter I enjoyed writing the most, and the whole book sort of leads up to it. So the chapter on debate and conflict. It is something, this is an issue that is very relevant for our own times as well. And it has often been pointed out that ancient India had a very long and lively tradition of vigorous debate. And that's absolutely true. It's not only in philosophy. If you look at all the different arenas, even if you look at Dharma Shastra, there was debate there, Artha Shastra, debate, an intellectual climate of debate really informs and informed and continues to inform any developments in any sphere of knowledge. You cannot have the development of knowledge, the further onward movement of ideas is not possible without debate. So there's plenty of evidence of that in ancient India. And if you look at just the philosophical sphere, as you pointed out, we talk about Vedanta, but the Vedantins were subdivided into so many different groups. So you have, Dvaita, you have Advaita, Vishishta Advaita, Bheda Bhedin, Vedantin, so on and so forth. So from a distance, we see these groups as uniform and singular, but internally, there were many divisions. And one of my favorite debates in the book, I have 2 favorite debates, if I can just tell you which these are, and they do touch on your question. One is the one between Janaka and Sulabha, a woman sage. And this is a debate that takes place with both debaters, with Sulabha inside the body, having entered the body of Janaka. Very interesting idea. A woman philosopher, rishi, sage, and philosopher king. And the other one is the debate between Shankaracharya and Mandana Mishra. Now, I pointed out in the book, these accounts of the debates are given in various hagiographic texts that were composed several centuries after Shankaracharya's time. So we don't know, to what extent the details can be relied on, and the details do vary quite a bit. But this was a debate between Shankaracharya, who became a leading proponent of Advait Vedant, and Mandana Mishra, who was a proponent of the Mimamsa school. And it was a very vigorous debate. And of course, according to the stories given in the hagiographies of Shankaracharya, it was he who won the debate. So there are these many exciting debates. But what I've also tried to point out in the book is that, yes, there is this tradition of debate, but who are the debaters? What is the audience? Let us recognize that participation in these debates was also limited by the kind of social hierarchies and social inequalities that existed. So you have a Gargi, you have a Sulabha, but most of the debates are men debating with each other. And similarly, groups who were lower down in the class hierarchy or caste hierarchy, by and large, there are some exceptions, but by and large, they remained outside these circles of debate that are recorded in the text, at least.
You also point towards violence, which doesn't get reflected or spoken about, but for a student of history, I mean, there are obvious references to, Chalukyan kings coming and, razing Kanchipuram to the ground and then looking at the Kailasanatha temple and saying, no, I can't destroy this. Or the Cholas going to Kalyani and destroying Kalyani, for instance. Or Kharavela, going and fighting and bringing the Jina back. So, I mean, there are constant areas of conflict, and one way of showing power is destroying the deity or taking away the deity of the rival. So there is this constant reference to it, and yet, in perception, we don't think about it. And that brings me to the question of violence and non-violence, Dr. Singh, because somewhere I feel, and that's why I introduced it saying such, that I feel that our obsession with the Mahabharata, the righteous war, and the righteousness of all kings who march towards victory, etc., has been the overarching influence in the way the contemporary writers have written about them and the way we perceive it. It's almost as though it was all about a righteous war in ancient India. There weren't any excesses on any side.
Well, Minnie, I actually think that the Mahabharata is a fantastic work, which is full of a lot of important insights into dharma, into the human condition, kingship, so on and so forth. And it's a very rich source of history. And it's been a very influential text, along with the Ramayana. So the epics have been culturally very important and influential across the centuries in different parts of the subcontinent and also in parts of Southeast Asia. But the problem arises when you consider the epics as factual accounts of things that actually happened. That's where a problem arises. And I think a lot of the misconceptions and also the quarrels and, the kind of very, very bitter conflicts that have taken place in our time, which have revolved around especially the Ram, the hero of the Ramayana, are based on, a lack of understanding of what the epic imagination is. Okay, these are wonderful texts. They are epics. They are larger than life. They are purveyors of values. They tell dramatic stories. But historians do not read these texts literally. What you see here is an example from Ellora of the telling of the Mahabharata on the walls of the Kailasanath temple at Ellora. And there's, these are stories that have continued to inspire folk art. I think there is a Paithani painting also in the book. And just to convey this important idea that the epics are not dead texts, they continue to inspire writing, creative writing, artistic expression, film, theater, literature across the centuries, right down to our own times. So the epic, I think the problem is not with the problem is in literal interpretations of ancient texts such as the epics. I think that's where the problem really.
So to quote from the book, you've said that Prashastis also gave an image of smooth political transitions. And in some senses, the the coexistence of war and social values, aided by the telling and the retelling of the Mahabharata across Asia, India, the subcontinent, and Southeast Asia, kind of iterated the image of the righteous king going on battle for dharma. You know, it was used as a text to justify, and so we miss out the nuances of the conflicts because that was written down.
Right. I think, Minnie, what you were saying really had to do with the presentation in the Mahabharata of the Kurukshetra war as a dharma yudh, and the preoccupation with dharma in the Mahabharata. And at the same time, of course, the Mahabharata also abounds in statements such as ahimsa paramo dharma. So, you know, this kind of contradiction within, at the heart of the epic itself, account of a very violent war and statements about ahimsa or anrishamsya, that is non-cruelty, being very important qualities. I think the reason why we don't see all the violence or haven't been prone to seeing all the violence in ancient Indian history has to do with our self-image of ourselves as a peaceful, harmony-loving, non-violent set of lot of people. And I don't know why we think that. You just have to look all around you. You have to read the newspapers, watch television to know that there's nothing inherently non-violent or peaceful about Indians. I actually discussed this issue in great detail in my previous book, Political Violence in Ancient India, where I pointed out that this idea of a peaceful, non-violent ancient India really emerges as a result of the importance of ahimsa in Gandhian nationalism. And Gandhi somehow created the impression that non-violence was deeply ingrained in the Indian psyche. But that's not true. We know it's not true. And the ancient texts are full of wars and all kinds of, you know, killing and aggression and violence of various other kinds as well. But there is a tension because there is the actual violence out there in politics, in society. And at the same time, there are texts such as the Mahabharata, such as the Buddhist and Jain texts, which are talking about the importance of non-violence. Another contradiction.
And it's a tough question, but I often wonder that if the chroniclers of ancient India, the contemporary records kind of gloss over the violence and make every war about the righteousness, juxtapose that to the Islamic early invasions, where they justify the invasion as, again, a religious war, as iconoclasts. So they're celebrating the destruction. Over here, you're glossing over the destruction. So in a sense, and that also perhaps accounts for this general view for people who've not read history that violence was something that came later. I mean, but anybody with any sense would say that there's no war without violence, and our history is full of battles, right?
Yes.
Let's get to one last question, which I find very interesting, on the question of the way women are seen. You know, you have the Shakta cult. Again, one of the things is that, you know, we've had so many cults, the Shakta, the Vaishnava, the Shaivite, and you point out that the idea of Hinduism as such, as a conglomerate, comes only in the 11th century, because of course there is some bit of coming together in the 4th, 5th century CE when all of these texts are put together. But my question to you is on the role of women, because the general perception is sati happens much later, but actual textual references to sati are pretty early in ancient India, aren't they?
They are. There aren't references in the Vedic corpus, but you do get a few references in the Mahabharata and Ramayana. But the references that I have, drawn on in the book come from Sangam texts, Sangam poems, which are composed between roughly the 2nd century BCE and 2nd, 3rd century CE, talk about sati. And apart from hero stones, we have hundreds and hundreds of hero stones that celebrate the heroic death of men in battles, in cattle raids, so on and so forth. We also have many sati stones, an image of a sati stone. Lots and lots of these sati stones, these don't usually have inscriptions, so we don't know who the women were or what the context was or what the specific period was, because these sati stones are not difficult to date, not easy to date, but very clear evidence from texts and also from the sati stones about the prevalence of the practice of sati from very early times. So it's not something that appears in the medieval period, just like violence does not make its first appearance in Indian history in medieval times with the coming of the Turks.
Right. It's interesting. And that's why history is full of nuances and there's no black and white in it, right? I mean, it has to be studied for what it's worth and looked at different sources. Let me take some questions now. Sanjay has this question. Professor, why is there no second edition of your 2009 textbook on ancient India? 12 years is so long. A new edition would be very welcome.
Sanjay, you're absolutely right. But, I have to get myself into the right frame of mind. In fact, I had decided that I should work on that second edition. And then I got the idea for another book. So I'm now keen to work on that. But, the second edition is absolutely essential. You're right. So give me, I shouldn't say give me a couple of years, but give me a little bit of time and you will see the second edition out.
Fantastic. Ishan Shah asked this question. Are there any primary textual or literal or visual sources that record the experience of the commoners subjected to slavery and inequalities? And are there references, I would add to that, of conflict, social conflict that we come across?
Yes. Now, as we've discussed earlier, the texts that have come down to us represent the points of view of upper class, upper caste men, mostly. So we have to look very hard at the sources to get glimmers of the experience, historical experience of slaves or lower caste people or whatever. But there are some places, sometimes you do get glimmers of the actual voices of subordinated people. So for instance, in the case of women, for instance, you have the Theri Gatha. There are a handful of other works, poems in different languages that have been composed by women. So the voices of women and lower classes and lower caste groups are few and far between, but you have to look hard for them and, you can find them.
In fact, I would say the Theri Gathas have pretty graphic accounts of mistresses beating up women. I mean, they're references to violence also. I mean,
that's right.
That's
right. You're talking about Punna's song, the woman who was a slave woman, and she talks about how she used to be beaten by her mistress.
Yes.
So that is one of those rare places where you get a woman slave's voice.
Right. So we had Charles Hellesy on the Theri Gatha on LHI Circle, and he took us through some of that. Let's go to the next question. We have Ranganathan who asked, and this is a very sensitive area, and I can't imagine how many people I've had this argument with, and most of them, I'm sorry to say, are non-history people, and that is why they ask these questions. But Mr. Ranganathan, you're absolutely bang on when you ask, why do Indians try to push back the dates in history to create the impression that ours is earlier kind of a civilization, and often this goes back to 3000 or 6000 BCE. You can't imagine, Dr. Singh, I mean, it's really appalling, but I've had senior scientists talk about astronomical dating based on the Puranas, which kind of take back, and it is confounding because it goes against the very grain of the history that we know across the world. So how do you justify, I mean, what is your reaction to something like that?
Well, chronology is a very political subject. History is a political subject, by the way, okay? Although we would like to, that's something I believe strongly in, that, one should keep political ideology out of history. That's my approach. But part of the political angle of history has to do with dates. So pushing back the dates of texts, pushing back the dates of a civilization, the beginnings of culture, then gives you a sense of extreme antiquity, which is pleasing to some. But as a historian, one has to go by the evidence. So if it is a text, you will go by the linguistic evidence, you will go by the internal references within the text, comparing it with other texts. You will have to look at the archaeological context. And it is on the basis of looking at all this evidence that you can actually gauge the date of a particular development or a particular text or whatever. So this is a problem that we live with. Dating is a contentious issue, and it has to do with the politicization of the past, especially ancient India. Ancient India is, as I've said, it's a mine, and it's also a minefield. And many people who are not professional historians are quite happy to hold forth on history and on texts and on chronology. But we have to go by the evidence.
And that is why we need more historians in discussions, in public platforms, talking about rational, evidence-based analysis, and not, the nonsense, if I can use the word, that we hear so often. We've got two questions on Buddhism by Vijay Balakrishnan, and I'm going to take them. The first is that when you look at Theravada versus Mahayana Buddhism, would you agree that Mahayana, through the concept of Bodhisattva, introduced a way for the clergy and royalty to reassert themselves, while Theravada was more egalitarian?
Well, Theravada is not, as I have discussed in the book, as egalitarian as you might think it is. Okay, all these terms, by the way, Theravada, Mahayana, etc., there's a lot that's been written about them. They're kind of complicated terms. But certainly the highest goal in the early forms of Buddhism is to become enlightened, to attain Nibbana, right? And then be freed from this awful cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Mahayana brings on the scene devotional practices. Okay, it is Buddhas and Bodhisattvas who can now form the object of worship. So bhakti, the element of bhakti, which we see in Vaishnavism, Shaivism, is also seen in Mahayana Buddhism, also in Jainism. So in that sense, it sort of broadens the scope for participation in religious activity and a new kind of religious devotion. So it's qualitatively different from what that arhat-centered, liberation-centered, solitary path goal that the within the context of a sangha, of course, that the early Buddhist texts put forward.
Vijay has another follow-on question, that in an excerpt I read of your book, you perhaps suggested that the eclipse of Buddhism in India was accompanied by violence from Brahminical and other sources, as opposed to the popular conception that Buddhism was defeated through debate. Can you elaborate? Also, I would like to add another dimension to it, that it wasn't as though Buddhism was always peaceful either, right? I mean, because you had Jain kings and Buddhist kings also run raids and go to war. So it's a complex. I don't know whether religion and war or power play was that interconnected. What is your sense?
So you're right. There are Jain kings and Jain generals. Look at Shravan Belgola, the Chamundaraya, who was a major patron in the setting up of the Gomateshwar image. And we have Kharavel, who is the 2nd century BCE king of Kalinga, who was a very devout Jain, but he boasts about the wars that he fought and won. And so I think this idea about the stereotypical idea about a peaceful Hinduism is accompanied by an idea about a very idealized idea about Buddhism also being a peaceful religion. But all Buddhists are, even if whatever texts say, people don't follow what texts necessarily say. And there's plenty of violence in the history of Buddhism. Look at Sri Lanka, look at Myanmar. So I don't think any religion can actually stand up and say that they have a zero tolerance towards violence. So there is a big difference, a big gap between theory and practice.
Yeah. So I think, Tara, this answers your question also about why do Indians think themselves as peaceful? Because we weren't peaceful. We all like to believe that we were peaceful. That's the crux of it. Dhareen has another question, which is a very relevant question. And I would say that this is another thing that makes India unique. The fact that even though there was violence, there was such a lot on non-violence. Across the world, there hasn't been a case of such an obsession with non-violence, of giving up, of detachment, of kings. Look at Chandragupta Maurya, for instance. At the height of his power, he walks away and starves himself to death in the Jaina fashion, or Ashoka. the celebration of the king who gives up, the non-violent aspect is kind of unique to India, isn't it?
That's absolutely correct. So it is not the case that ancient Indians were non-violent. No, there's plenty of evidence that indicates otherwise. But ancient Indian thinkers, religious leaders, intellectuals did debate the tension between violence and non-violence more intensely than anywhere else in the world. And renunciation, you're absolutely right. Renunciation is a major cultural issue across the centuries. Even today, the figure of the yogi or the sannyasi, the sadhu, there is a certain kind of aura that is attached to these renunciants. So that's a very important feature of Indian culture across the centuries.
What I found very interesting in the book is also your analysis of Shankaracharya, or what the textual references actually talk about as you talk about Shankaracharya. Because according to you, it was in the 15th century under the Vijayanagara Empire that Shankara gets resurrected as this great pan-India figure who travels across. In his own lifetime, he wasn't really viewed as this great person who walked through India, etc. And of course, like we referred to earlier, there were tensions where even the Dvaita school of Vedanta criticized him pretty sharply.
That's correct. There are various scholars who worked on Shankara, who have worked on the religious biographies of Shankara, and they've actually analyzed these hagiographies in great detail. So I have drawn on the work of these scholars, and it's quite clear that he was not such a major influential figure in his own time. It's several centuries later, in the Vijayanagara period especially, that Shankaracharya becomes the focus of so many hagiographies, which present him in a light that is rather different from his own works.
Which is very interesting, because Tara has asked this question, did he ever go to Kashmir? I mean, is there any reference to him going to Kashmir?
Well, you have the Shankara Digvijayas, and it's very interesting that the word Digvijaya or Vijaya is used in the hagiographies. But if you look, remember, these are hagiographies and not biographies. And you have these kinds of hagiographies around religious figures across the board in various religious traditions. So whether it is factual or not, sometimes it becomes difficult to actually ascertain. But when an account is written several centuries after somebody's lifetime, you have to certainly be prepared to accept that not all the details that are given in these hagiographies can be accepted as historical fact. He did travel extensively. I mean, that's the sense one gets, that he did, travel extensively. There are certain basic details about his life that can be accepted. His becoming a sannyasi at an early age, his traveling around, his debating vigorously with various contemporaries. So those things are there, but the details are difficult to verify.
Right. The last question is from Bhuf, who has asked, what is the role of audiences in the creation of art in ancient India beyond that of patrons? Was it a top-down kind of, as the great men theories of history would have us believe? What sense you get? Though in Sanchi you have a lot of the patrons of art are merchants across the caves, across from Python to Sopara. You will see a lot of patronage coming from merchants who walk these paths, the trade routes. But in this larger sense, how do you see the common folk? And their relationship to art?
Well, art needs patronage to flourish. And Minnie, as you pointed out, apart from, we often think of kings as major patrons of art, but there are people who are obviously not poor or destitute people. They obviously had enough money to, pay the artists and the craftsmen and so on and so forth. But they came from various walks of life. The question that was raised was about the audience, which is a little different. So it's one thing to ask about, who are the people who gave the money to finance the monuments of Sanchi? Another question, a different sort of question that was, I think, asked was, if I was a pilgrim, if I was a devout Buddhist who visited Sanchi, and I circumambulated stupa number 1, and I saw all these sculptures, scenes from the life of the Buddha, beautiful, sensuous Shalabhanjikas, how would I have responded to them? How would I have reacted to them? Would I have noticed them at all? Or would I have been so caught up in my own devotion that I did not bother to, or did not look at the details? So that is the question of spectatorship. That is a very interesting question in relation to Indian art. And that's different from patronage.
Okay. I'm going to end with a question that I have, and I think that's a great way to sum up this discussion. You refer somewhere into the book by saying that if one of the apsaras in one of the sculptures was to come back to India today, she would be appalled at how puritanical we've become. Also, how close we've become, because I think you have a reference to the writing of Mahendravarman, the Pallava king, where he's written a play or a story where they're taking a dig at various so-called medicants from different faiths. And there is this woman and this man who are in a tavern, who are drinking, who are drunk, and who go around. And what stood out for me is that somewhere we've become so close. We've everybody's so scared of talking truth or laying it out the way it is, because we're very conscious about what the general perception is. And the perception is one of puritanical, very, very closed-minded societies. And that is not what ancient India was. And I think we must make that point as a rounding up of this discussion.
No, absolutely. Because apart from, texts that seem to be very, status quoist, we do have a very strong and rich tradition of critique and questioning. The Matta Vilasa Prahasana, which you mentioned, is one such farce which dares to take on the Shaiv Pashupatas and the Buddhists and so on and so forth. Kshaimendra, I think Kshaimendra would be a good point to end on, the 11th century Kashmiri writer, scholar, who wrote very satirical, very biting critiques of various groups in society. And he made fun of them, whether it is doctors or lawyers or holy men or writers. Kshaimendra takes all of them on and he tears them to pieces. And one of the things I mention in the book, and I do wonder, is that if Kshaimendra had lived not in the 11th century, but in the 21st century, what would have happened to the poor man? He would have spent his whole life dragging himself from one law court to another, because there would have been people who he would have upset so many people. Obviously, he survived and he continued to write in 11th century Kashmir, but I don't know whether he would have survived in 21st century India.
Yeah, he would have definitely been trolled, because that's a new term, right?
That's true.
Well, that's what, this is just a small discussion, Dr. Singh. I mean, we hope to have a lot more of you on this forum, because this book opens up tantalizing questions, because there is a tendency when you talk about ancient India to try, because there's so many gaps, to try and fill the gaps. So many books on ancient India are about the linear chronological history, trying to fill the gaps. And by the way, we are also putting out a book next year, so you will be waiting for that. But I think the history of ideas, the shape of things that came about, I think that's a very interesting conversation. And who better than you, Dr. Singh, to talk about it, given the kind of work that you have done, over the last 2 decades, really, and the 12 books that you've written, all power to you. I think we need more scholars like you to talk to a lay audience, because I think it's important that history moves out of just academia or ivory towers and comes across and explains the stories that make India. And I think that's where the nuances come in. That's where the understanding comes in. So many thanks for joining us today. Really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you very much to you, Minnie, and also to your audience. I enjoyed it a great deal. Thank you so much.
Thank you.